nomadic hunter-gatherer is a style of goddess worship and psychedelic shamanism and orgiastic religion. And the shamanism and the religion overlap each other considerably. The style that replaced that was a style of domination, hierarchy, with alpha males, with powerful males controlling females at the center of these hierarchies. And to my mind, the concern that caused the shift was the accumulation in the psyche of these hominids of enough ego that there became concern for the line of male paternity. In other words, men wanted to know who their children were. And that made the orgiastic style of religion in conflict, because that was all about, the children were the children of the group, and sex was a shared activity, even though there might be bonding. But once men got it into their heads that they wanted to know who their offspring were, then females had to be controlled very rigidly, and there had to be control of sexual, and the whole thing just turned into a nightmare. My women, my property, my children, my food, my territory, so on and so forth. Well, you see, what had been going on before was a true incipient symbiosis. And this is, I think, the new idea that I want to communicate, and that I'm absolutely, one, serious about, and two, literal about, that our glory and our uniqueness and why we are as we are is because we are a plant-animal symbiotic species. Our ordinary state, our state of nature, the way in which we existed until 10,000 years ago, was in a very tightly bound symbiotic relationship with plants. They were, we domesticated them, and we spread them, and we created environments for them through the use of burning. And in return for this mysterious connection opened up, where real information couched in humanly cognizable terms, information about where the reindeer went, who you should marry, what the weather's going to do, stuff like that. Real information began to be traded back and forth. Now, biologists are familiar with the notion of pheromones, message-bearing chemicals that regulate behavior within a species. But we're just getting ready to go to the next level and recognize the possibility of what have been called exopheromones, pheromones that regulate behavior between species. And it's very clear that, in climaxed ecosystems of great age, such as the equatorial tropics of this planet, exopheromonal interactions become the major mediating force in all the evolutionary exchanges going on. The old notion of competition and survival of the fittest is now seen to be bankrupt. The way nature works is it's the species that can make itself most necessary to other species, the one that can cut energy deals with the most of its neighbors, that is the successful one. So you maximize cooperation, you maximize dependency, you maximize integration. This is the successful evolutionary strategy. I mean, of course you can be a jaguar and crash around in the forest and eat things immediately smaller than you, but jaguars will be a memory in the fossil record of this planet when the plants will still exist, given, that man were not part of the picture. So the dynamic of life dictates that these energy levels be held very close.
Is that outside of the natural or around?
Well, no, I think, nothing is outside of the natural, but all of this can be explained in terms of climatological flux on the African continent. Very briefly, the primates evolved in Africa. Out of the primates came the hominids, which were these gracile, upright, opposable thumb, binocular vision. And there were a number of these, and they existed for, over the past 6 million years. But Africa and the planet, because of repeated glaciation, is subject to cycles of drying. And every time the ice moved south, primate populations were bottled up in Africa. And we know there have been 4 glaciations. Immediately the last one, the ice melted 20,000 years ago. And out of Africa, that last time, came pastoralists, people who had domesticated cattle and had a style of following cattle around rather than being just strictly hunter-gatherers. Well, I maintain what happened was these arboreal, tree canopy living apes came under pressure as the continent dried up to expand their diet because the forests were disappearing and being replaced by grassland. Well, most animal species eat only 1 or 2 kinds of food. This is a general rule in nature, and it's in order to hold down exposure to mutagenic influence. But when an animal population is in a situation of food scarcity, the logical thing to do is to begin to test food sources and to expand your repertoire of food. Well, that's what these primates coming out of the trees did. Number one, they began eating meat, which gave them a real interest that they had never had before in these ungulate mammals that were evolving in the grasslands. And they began to test all kinds of other foods in the environment. Well, when you do that, you are exposing your population to mutation. And mutation rates soar. And it was during this period that the human brain size doubled in like 1.5 million years. Someone said it was the most rapid evolutionary expansion of a major organ ever seen in the fossil record. Nothing like it ever happened. Why? What was making this happen? Well, it looks like probably huge numbers of mutations were taking place in this population because people were literally eating anything they could get their hands on. And in this environment of the grasslands, the mushrooms were growing on the dung of these ungulate animals. Well, now a weird thing about psilocybin is that in very low doses, doses so low that you don't feel anything, your vision improves. They've done tests with this, and there is an improvement in visual acuity on psilocybin at low doses. Well, you can imagine the evolutionary impact of something like this on a hunting-gathering population where visual acuity is all that stands between you and grim starvation. It means a population of animals, a population of these evolving hominids that accept the mushroom into their diet, have just been given a tremendous leg up on nearby competing troops that don't have it. It's like chemical binoculars. So immediately then there is a reason, an evolutionary reason, for mushrooms to be eaten and for the spread, for mushrooms to be accepted into the diet as an item and so forth and so on. Well, so then you take slightly more mushrooms, and like all alkaloids, and it's a CNS arousal. It means you feel alert, you feel interested, you want a boogie, and also, if you're male, you can sustain an erection. So arousal means arousal. So then this stuff is an enzyme promoting sexual activity at that level. Well, sexual activity, the number of copulations that occur within a population is directly related to the number of successful impregnations. So suddenly you have these horny primates, be a lot of more interest in sexual contact and partners and all that. This means that these psilocybin-using creatures that are now more successful at hunting and more interested in sex have all kinds of pressures on them that will force them to outbreed the dull, uninteresting folks who don't use mushrooms at this point. Well, so then yet higher doses, it changes, and it's no longer about sexual activity or clarity of vision. It becomes about the psychedelic trip, this tremendum, which is as awesome to you and me as it was to these so-called primitive folks 20,000 years ago. We don't know what to make of it. They didn't know what to make of it. They founded a religion about it. We're trying to start the engine of the same religion all over again. And the way in which this religious ecstasis manifests itself is in language activity, in cognition, but in glossolalia, in spontaneous outbursts of syntactically organized vocal activity. Well, the great mystery of human emergence, of course, is language. What is it? Where did it come from? How did it ever get going on such a scale? So forth and so on. But it looks to me like what we're seeing in psilocybin is a kind of neurological enzyme, a catalyst in the environment that could take an evolving primate population and put it through a series of forced changes that produce ultimately a self-reflected, minded creature practicing a shamanic mother goddess religion in this nomadic context. And that was paradise, and that was the ideal for the archaic revival. In other words, that Eden actually existed, that we are made for better things than what we've got. You know, it says in Finnegan's Wake, here in Moycane was the red light district of Dublin. Here in Moycane we flop on the seamy side, but up Nayent, prospector, you sprout all your worth and woof your wings. That's a promise for the future. Up Nayent you sprout all your worth and woof your wings. But also, antes, we sprouted our worth and woofed our wings. And this whole nostalgia for a perfected shamanism in prehistory is reasonable, I think. I mean, I think we had something, an unimaginably precious gift. We had consciousness and dynamic order. Consciousness as we experience it now within the confines of history is most analogous to cancer. I mean, it's just, replicating, spreading. But it once was a dynamic, ordered thing. People lived, they died, they made love, they had children, they herded their flocks, they had ecstatic flights into dimensions which we cannot even conceive of, and they felt no need, to break into the earth, to divert the rivers, to do all of this stuff. And even if we're not aesthetically attracted to that, we have to make a value judgment on it because it was not a runaway process. It did not push everything toward crisis. Okay, well then, so what happened? What the hell happened if that's how it was? Well, nature is just an ongoing story. The very drying processes that created those grasslands, that created those pressures on diet, that created that mother goddess religion, that evolved those ungulate animals, that process continued. And the grasslands dried up. And the winds began to blow. And the water holes got further and further apart from each other. And the mushroom festivals went from every Saturday night to the first Saturday of every month, and then to 4 times a year, and then to once a year, and then to once every 5 years, and then to never. And in the absence of the psychedelic experience, this ego thing gets going. I mean, it is literally like a calcareous growth in the bloodstream of the psyche. If you don't inoculate yourself against it, it will begin to take root and grow. and the world, the boundaries of the world begin to move inward, you know, and you no longer see things on a planetary scale or a millennial scale, or it's just about, you know, my women, my money, my land, my children, all of this stuff. And at that point, you get the appearance of historical civilizations. You have kingship, you know, the age of Gilgamesh. I mean, my God, when you read the story of Gilgamesh, you just wonder what's going on. Gilgamesh spurned the goddess, and the goddess sent a bull, which to me is, you know, symbolic of the mystery of the mushroom, the ungulate herding horned animal, the crypto symbol for the god. The goddess sends a bull, and he rejects the bull. He rejects the goddess. He rejects the bull. Then he takes Enkidu, the shaman figure, and forces him to go with him into the wilderness. And what do they do in the wilderness? This oldest of all myths, this story of the first men. What do? They cut down the tree of life. That's what they do. They cut down the tree of life. And then they, you know, it goes forward. The earliest strata of mythology that comes out of these Middle Eastern civilizations is full of this male-female nature-artificial tension. The story of Genesis is a similar thing. I mean, what's happening in Genesis is history's first drug bust. A woman is involved with a plant, and the plant opens their eyes, and they see that they are naked, which happens to be the case. They are naked. So in other words, they see, they grok their true existential condition. And Yahweh, wandering around mumbling to himself in the garden, says, this thing that these people have done, what if they eat of the fruit of the tree of life? Then they will be as we are. So it's very clear that there is concern to withhold knowledge, that human beings are to be held in an inferior position. Otherwise, if they were to eat of the fruit of the tree of life, of knowledge, they would be as we are. So there's this whole tension. And in the story in Genesis, you'll recall Adam and Eve are cast out of Eden, and an angel is set at the east of Eden with a burning sword. Well, what I take this to be about is it's a story from a strata where already the shift to the dominator culture has taken place. But they're looking backward at the partnership society on the grasslands of Africa. And the angel with the burning sword is nothing more than the sun. That they literally were cast out of Eden. Eden disappeared around them. It dried up and blew away. And there was nowhere to go but the Nile Valley and Palestine. And these people who appear in the Nile Valley and Palestine at about 9,800 BC, called Natufian, come out of nowhere with a very high culture and a tremendous ability to exploit plant resources. And I think they are the remnants of this partnership culture. And you see the way in which all this ties into the present and attempts to be more than just a kind of cultural reconstruction of prehistory is we're trying to understand who we are, why we are the way we are. Well, the major thing that now that we have transcended ideology, and nobody gives a hoot whether you're a Marxist or any of that anymore because we've all seen through that, the new issue is human nature. And it evolves around this drug thing. You know, is it the true and purest expression of human nature that you should drink nothing but cold water and eat nothing but raw vegetables, and any departure from this is an abomination? And then when you get to drugs, you know, this is really an abomination. What should be our relationship to substances. And why are we the addictive creatures that we are? I mean, I know that elephants intoxicate on papayas and bumblebees get loaded on sugar water and this and that. But human beings addict to dozens of substances, to behaviors. I mean, all kinds of things. A guy goes out in the morning to pick up his paper off his porch, and it's not there. And he has a heart attack. You know, he has to sit down. My God, you know, what am I going to... And he has to have instant relief from the traumatic crisis of the non-presence of the morning information fix. And the phenomenon of falling in love, which doesn't really happen with other animals. I mean, other animals bond, but they don't go bananas in the way that we do on this issue. We're chemically highly cued in a way that a lot of animals around us aren't. So then history, because of this addictive drive within us that we have because of this disrupted symbiotic relationship in prehistory. See, we're looking for the score, but we can't quite find it. Imperialism doesn't do it. Heroin doesn't do it. Sadomasochism doesn't do it. Nothing quite does it. But we keep trying stuff. Cocaine, money, fascism, mercantilism, ideology, all of this stuff. We are very, very restless. And the path of our restless, frantic peregrinations across the intellectual landscape is what we call history. You know, it's our effort to try and get straight, get back to something which we feel we deserve and that we lost, and that we don't know quite what it was. Well, meanwhile, in the rainforests, in the Arctic tundra, these little brown people have been keeping the gnosis going, never questioning, never doubting, millennia after millennia, going into these hyperdimensional mind spaces and operating there. While this has been going on, we have been elaborating positivism, scientific philosophy, building atom smashers, so forth and so on. We have created, then, out of our infantile cultural style, what Erich Fromm would call a fecal cultural style, because we just excrete stuff, you know, all kinds of stuff. They have held this mystery. But they, to my mind, the mistake that has been made is that it's been thought that they understood it. That we now go to the shamans and they will explain to us what the inner skinny is on all this. That isn't it. There's no explaining this. Once you've been there, you know the futility of a notion like understanding the psychedelic experience. It's like understanding the ocean, or understanding the planetary ecology. We think that things are to be understood, but some things are simply to be, you know, what's the word, appreciated, imbibed, to be in the darshan of them. Well, let's talk a little bit more as we were this morning. I talked more than I intended to this morning. What is anybody's take on this, or did anybody not get their licks in this morning? Yeah.
You mentioned the odd and the strange and the weird. Other than hallucinogens, you know, how can we fool this brain away from the ego?
It's pretty difficult.
Yeah.
I think that's why we're in the situation we're in.
Talking about things we could do every day, not once a month, I guess.
Well, there's no substitute for awareness in any situation. I mean, part of the work, I think, is the spectacular episodes of intoxication that break down the boundaries of our personality and reorient us and recast it. But then the other thing is just living that out from day to day. And there's no substitute for hard work. I mean, people say, how can psychedelics be real? You're saying it's some kind of shortcut to spiritual wisdom. Well, it may be a shortcut, but nobody said it's easy. It isn't easy. No. It just is that it's ultimately effective. I don't know. I find myself preaching a doctrine that is hardly welcome in the touchy-feely circles that I'm usually teaching in, which is stifle it. Now there's a doctrine to take home from the New Age. Stifle it, you know. The ego is much too large. I mean, we need an ego, yes. That's so that if you take somebody to dinner, you know whose mouth to put food in. That's having an ego. But above and beyond that, it becomes sort of superfluous. It's a habit, it's a bad habit. It's an infantile response that has been culturally supported to the point where it's become institutionalized.
Do you believe the person needs a strong enough ego before they can transcend or transform it, though? The reason I'm saying that is because I've seen a lot of teenagers in the city, and then they experiment a lot with drugs, and especially with psychedelics. And sometimes I wonder if they're really getting anything out of that early experimentation. I didn't get into psychedelics until my late 20s, so
Well, see, it's a real complicated question. Civilizations evolve folkways to deal with the drugs that they're interested in, and this takes hundreds, thousands of years. Part of the question I hear you asking is, you say that these drugs dissolve the ego, but aren't some people in a weakened ego condition when they come upon them? And I think probably you're right. It's not clear that the onset of puberty, when there's a good deal of psychosexual and endocrine confusion going on anyway, is the precise right moment that you want to drop these psychedelics on somebody, although this is done in many traditional societies. But the problem is that in societies where there is shamanism, there's an understood way to do it. There's an understood way to initiate somebody. Kids growing up on the streets taking drugs of all sorts in doses of all sorts, it's very hard to sort it out. You know, I mean, people don't have intent, they don't have focus, they don't have information. They're just, everything is so fragmented in modern life. Part of what all this yammering about shamanism might eventually lead to is the reformation of psychotherapy along the lines of a shamanic style, so that then you know, people could have these voyages, could have the insight into their problems that you get from psychedelics.
Also in those cultures and societies where they do use the psychotropic drug at puberty, I think those societies support the individual, the child growing up in very positive ways and feed their ego in a very constructive, positive way, so that they are not filled with a lot of self-consciousness and self-hatred and lack of self-worth and so forth, a lot of the critical nature that I think, and the lack of nurturing and attention that a lot of the adolescents grow up in our society with, that then get weak egos from adolescence on into adulthood. And I think the developmental quality of life in different cultures has a lot to do with one's ability to utilize the drug, the plants effectively.
Cooperation is just an automatic response among many of these rainforest hunting, gathering people. I mean, when you finish a job, it isn't your job. When you finish a job, you go on and you do another job until all the jobs are done. And this is clearly a learned response, because these are human beings just like us, but under the extreme pressure of being, 20 people trying to hold it together in the rainforest through gathering, they have accepted that the tribal unit is the lowest common denominator, and that everything has to operate in the light of that. Back here.
I felt that part of what was being discussed here was the difference between discursive and one-pointed meditation. And discursive meditation is like meditating on the Stations of the Cross if you're Catholic, or the seven sheaths of the Self if you're a Hindu. And it sort of serves years of doing that as establishing a ladder that can take you to the transcendent. And that one-pointed meditation, and even more profoundly, the use of psychedelics can suddenly put you into a transcendent state. And whether you'll have the capacity to get back is the question. And so that there might be a role for a period of discursive meditation or an education along that way before something that instantly propelled you into an experience of the transcendent.
Yes, although this difficulty getting back is an interesting thing to talk about, because I certainly know what you mean. I think everybody who takes psychedelics a lot eventually has a trip that stands their hair on end. And the reasonable fear I've always felt about psychedelics was not that it would kill you. That's not reasonable. But the somewhat murkier question, could it drive you mad, is a little harder to just, of course not, because, hell, why not? I mean, it's definitely rubbing up against those areas. But I have real faith that it is, it's like flipping a coin and getting it to land on its edge. The psychedelic experience represents such a state of disequilibrium that in almost all cases the entire system is striving to return to normal, and will do so very quickly. My life is built around one spectacular exception where